Welcome to DLS's Instructor Training Series. This session is on crafting effective lesson plans. So before we write a lesson plan, before we even can sit down to write it, it's important to know who lesson plans are for. We usually think of lesson plans as being for the teacher, so you can think about what you're going to teach and put it in order and all of that. But at DLS, a few people in addition to the teacher read lesson plans or may read lesson plans. So take a minute and think about, at DLS, in addition to the teacher, who might read a lesson plan? So at DLS, we can see there are several people who may read a lesson plan. The first one is the students. This is usually up to the teacher. You can choose to share the lesson plan with your student if you want to. And since our students are adults and professionals, they may want to see what they're going to work on, what the aims are, and how it builds toward their overall goals. So they may read it with interest. Of course, as teachers, we will read our own lesson plans. And then your language training supervisor, your LTS, is going to read your lesson plan. And, if you're the teacher, you might be reading it to see like, oh, what am I doing today? What am I doing in the next hour? But your LTS is usually going to be looking more at the overall structure of the day and see, okay, are the students' needs being met? In some cases, depending on which class you're teaching, the students' agencies may read your lesson plan, but don't be worried about this. They always give us notice when they're going to look at the plans. But when they're looking at lesson plans, they really want to see, what kind of methodology is the teacher following? Are they using a communicative methodology? And that's what they're looking for. And then the final one is for accreditation. As you may know, DLS is in the process of becoming accredited, and lesson plans are a requirement for that. Okay, great. So now that we have some context for lesson plans, let's take a look at our objectives in this session. First is to identify what goes into a lesson plan, so the ingredients, if you will. Then we want to get to know the DLS Online Lesson Plan feature. And then finally, we want to look at some time-saving strategies for lesson plans and how we can make this efficient and really be efficient with our time. So first, let's consider what the elements of a lesson plan are, or we could say what the ingredients of a lesson plan are, what goes into a lesson plan. So take a moment and pause the video here and think about a few ways to complete this sentence. Okay, great. Hopefully you paused the video and thought of some good ideas. Let's see what we've got. So maybe one of the first things you thought of was objectives. You probably thought of that because that's one of the most important parts of a lesson plan. It tells us what our goal is and where we're going. Topic or theme is probably something you'll include. Materials, so you might be using a textbook or a newspaper article or maybe a YouTube video. Activities, of course, this is what you do with the student. And then homework, if you give the student something to work on after class, this goes in your lesson plan. Assessment, this might be something that's quick and informal, or it might be a more formal kind of assessment. Let's start with objectives and topics. So this is what the fields will look like on the DLS Online lesson plan format. Objectives and topics. So here for objectives, if you're teaching a 1 or 2 hour class, you might have one objective or two. If you're teaching a full-time class for 6 hours a day, you'll probably write more than one objective up here. You might write 2 objectives for the day, you might have 3 or 4, or you might have 6, 1 per hour. So We said earlier that objectives are one of the most important parts of a lesson. So let's start by looking at some best practices for objectives. So first, objectives should be proficiency based. This is probably the most important thing on this slide. And that means that objectives should describe what students can do with the language. And we'll look at some examples of what that means. And then second, objectives should be SMART. You may have heard this acronym before. It stands for specific, measurable. So when we give students an objective, we want to be able to measure and see whether or not they have achieved it. So we want to give them something that's specific enough that we can see whether or not they have they've done it, they've achieved it. We want it to be achievable for them, so we don't want it to be too hard. We also don't want it to be too easy, so it should be in their appropriate level. It should be relevant, so relevant to the student's goals and the skills they'll need after they finish their class, their language class. And then the final one is time bound, and this just means that the student can accomplish the objective in an appropriate time. With the following in mind, take a look at these objectives here and decide which one you think is the best. Take a moment to pause the video, read these objectives, and decide which one you think is the best. Okay, hopefully you took a moment to read those. Let's go ahead and show the answer here. Answer is C, describe the house you want to live in. So let's look at why the others are not what we're looking for. So A, learn Chapter 7 vocabulary. It is specific, but we can see a couple of things wrong with it. The first one is it's not really proficiency based. It doesn't tell us what the student can do with the language. It tells us what they're going to learn about the language, but not really what they can do. So we don't like A. B is a little bit better. That is proficiency based, talk about houses. But if we think about our SMART objectives, we can see it's not really specific and it's not really measurable. Like, how will I tell if my students have achieved this goal? It's not really specific enough for me as a teacher to measure. So then we come to C, describe the house you want to live in. So first, this is proficiency based. This is something a real life speaker of a language might do. Second, it is SMART. It's specific, we can measure it. It's most likely relevant to our student, and it's achievable for a 1-1+ student. Here are a few other objectives, examples of objectives. So here, for example, this R just means reading. So if your student is level 1, you might have them read a description of hotels and maybe choose the best one. Or maybe understand basic information in 3 TV advertisements. Or you might have them talk about a home renovation project that they're doing. So we can see that these are all proficiency based. These are things that require the students to do something in the language, and they're all tasks that a real life person might do. And then, and they also meet our SMART criteria. They're specific. We can measure if the student can do this or not, and they should be achievable for someone at a 1. And then coming to a 2, we might have the student, if they're speaking, maybe tell a story about a social event that they attended. We might have them watch a TV show or part of one and answer some questions, some comprehension questions. Or they might read an email and summarize for a colleague. So again, these are proficiency based, they're real life tasks, and they meet our SMART criteria. One helpful tool with writing objectives is using action verbs. You're probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. This is a really common tool to use when writing objectives. So you can see on the right here, this is a Bloom's taxonomy wheel. You can find a lot of these on the internet, and they're just a really helpful aid for writing objectives to help you think of action verbs to put in your objectives. And then for topics, there are some common topics for ILR levels 1, 2, and above. So if you've used Gloss or NFLC Portal, you've seen these topics before. Let's start with level 1. These are sometimes called the Forte topics. So take a moment, pause the video, see if you can remember what those topics are. All right, hopefully you thought of all of those. So let's take a look. So these are the level 1 Forte topics. So that's family, occupation, recreation, so hobbies, etc., travel, and education. So these are just considered the broad level 1 topics. You can see they're concrete. They're about things that are connected to the learner, things that are relevant to their personal lives. So those are all characteristics of level 1. Now for level 2 and up, again, there are some common topics here. There's no handy acronym to remember them though. So take a moment, pause the video, and see if you can write a couple of them down. Okay, great. Hopefully you had plenty come to mind. Let's take a look. So here we've got politics, science, technology, geography, economics, military, security, environment, culture, and society. So we see that these topics are a lot more abstract, dealing with really abstract topics and dealing with things that go beyond the learner, go beyond their daily life or their immediate life. So those are really characteristics that we get into with ILR levels 2 and above. So these can be helpful to refer to when you're choosing topics for your class. You can keep a list of these nearby to help you think of ideas. So here are some more examples of topics. The DLS online lesson plan format does let you show a topic and a subtopic, so you can add that if you want to. So for example, for level 1, you might have occupation, and maybe your subtopic is job responsibilities, so it's a little more specific. Leisure and hobbies, travel, maybe you ask a student to compare Airbnb versus staying in a hotel. So again, just a little more added specificity. And then for level 2, you can again see the more specific topics. These are of course just examples. Now let's take a look at the next part of the DLS online lesson format, which is materials. So here you can add the materials, of course, that you use for your class. This is pretty straightforward. So if you're using a textbook, just include the book name and the page number or numbers. If you're using authentic materials, put in the website name, the link, and the article title or the title of the YouTube video or what have you. For a web application, maybe you're using Gloss or an NFLC Portal activity, then just include the topic, the title of the lesson, and the link. And then if you're using something that you created, just write instructor created and include the topic and type of material. So it might say role play or picture description activity or something like that. And then the next part is skill focus. And that is, of course, the skills you want to focus on for that hour. So as you notice, you can select more than one. If you want to select all 4, you can, or you can select the 1 or 2 that you feel like are the real focus of the hour. And then once you've selected the skill, you can select the activities also from a drop-down menu. And here again, you can select more than one, or you can just choose one. And this is a pretty long list. You'll see that when you use this in DLS Online, this list has a lot of options. We mentioned at the beginning of this session that we wanted to look at some time-saving features for lesson plans. And this is one of those features where we hope this will really be time-saving for you as a teacher. So here you can choose what kind of activities and then just write a minimal description in the box here. So hopefully this will save you time. And then activity details, that's where you write what you're going to do in that hour. So let's take a look at this activity description. Learn new vocabulary. We can see that maybe that's it's a little vague. Uh, we'd like maybe a few more details. If you're the LTS reading this, or maybe if you were a client who were looking at this, you might want to say, well, what vocabulary, or how is the student going to learn it? So here is some ways where you might reword it. So you might say what type of vocabulary. So if we imagine that our objective is what we looked at earlier in this PowerPoint, describe the house you want to live in. So some vocabulary you might learn for that would be house and apartment vocabulary. And then you might just say, you would do a little practice, maybe picture matching and description. So you don't need to write a lot here. Bullet points are fine. You don't need to give, you can make it informal. Again, we want this to be a time-saving feature for you, so you don't need to write a ton in here unless you want to. And then assessment is the next box. So here again, you'll have a drop-down menu, and that will allow you to select the assessment type. So an assessment for a lesson plan is just a check to see if the student has met the objective or objectives from that day. So it connects back to your objectives. And it can be formal or informal. It can be anything from like an informal exit ticket that's very quick, short and sweet, or it can be more formal or longer. And it should be something that you give feedback on. So let's look at some examples of assessments. So again, let's go back to the objective we have from the beginning of this PowerPoint. Describe the home you want to live in. And here's some example assessments we could do. So you might have the students give a mini presentation, maybe 1 minute on their ideal home. You might have them say 3 things their ideal home must have. So these first 2 are pretty short, pretty informal, something you might just do as an exit ticket in the last few minutes of class. Or if you wanted something longer, you might have the student role play a conversation, for example, between a realtor and a home buyer, where the student has to describe what they want in a home. So that would be a longer, more like a performance assessment that you could do. So all of these are really good options for assessments. And then finally, homework. You know what homework is, of course. It's whatever you assign to the student to do some reinforcement. So here are just some examples of homework. Again, going back to that example objective about describing your ideal home. You might have the student make some vocab flashcards. Maybe if they did the role play as their assessment, you might have them write that dialogue as homework. Or you can just give some exercises from the book. So again, you can see you don't need to write a lot here. You don't need to make full sentences. It can be informal. That's totally fine. Okay, thank you for watching this session. Hopefully you found it useful. If you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like us to know about lesson planning, please feel free to reach out to your LTS. Thank you so much.